So, picture this. It's 1949. Standing at the Gate of Heavenly Peace in Beijing, Mao Zedong announces the creation of the People's Republic of China. For a country that had been torn apart by war for decades, this was meant to be a brand new start, a promise of a better world. But that promise, well, it would curdle into one of the biggest man-made disasters in all of human history. So, how on earth did a vision of a worker's paradise lead to a catastrophe on a scale that's almost impossible to imagine? Let's get into it.
To really wrap your head around what was about to happen, you have to start with this one kind of mind-blowing number. In 1949, 1 out of every 5 people on the entire planet was a Chinese peasant. These were the people Mao had promised everything to: a new world, no more crushing landlords, no more poverty. They were the very heart of his revolution. And, as it turns out, they would be the ones to suffer the most. All right, so the new state is established. Job 1? Lock down absolute control. They called it a people's democratic dictatorship, which, sounds a little contradictory, and in reality it was anything but democratic. A super rigid, top-down power structure got cemented into place, and fast.
I mean, just look at this pyramid. It really shows you how tight that grip on power was. You've got a nation of over 500 million people, and pretty much every major decision, the kind that affects every single person's life, is being made by just 5 guys. That's the Standing Committee. And on it, you had people like the expert organizer Liu Shaoqi, the incredibly skilled diplomat Zhou Enlai, and right at the very top, of course, was Mao Zedong himself, the supreme leader, no question about it. The China the communists took over in 1949 was, to put it mildly, a wreck. The country was on its knees. Infrastructure was destroyed. People were just exhausted. And the economy was in a total freefall thanks to hyperinflation. So, to fix all this, the party looked to its big brother in ideology, the Soviet Union. About 10,000 Soviet advisors came flooding into China, and they brought the playbook for a rapid, state-controlled rebuild.
And man, the party moved fast to completely remake society from the ground up. Some of the changes were genuinely radical, and for the better. Land was taken from the wealthy elite and just handed over to 300 million peasants. New laws gave women more rights than they'd ever had. They even introduced a simplified writing system to help more people learn to read. But all of this progress came with a very dark side. Over 1 million landlords were publicly humiliated and killed. The middle class in the cities was systematically crushed, all in the name of getting rid of counter-revolutionaries, which was this scary, vague label you could slap on pretty much anyone you didn't like.
So with things getting locked down at home, the new government started looking outward, to its huge borders. In 49, they reoccupied the massive western region of Xinjiang. A couple of years later, in 51, the army marched into Tibet, annexing it in what they called the peaceful liberation. But the biggest test of all was already blowing up right next door. War had broken out in Korea.
Mao was terrified of an American-led invasion, so he sent over 2 million volunteers pouring across the border into Korea. The human cost was just astronomical. The Chinese military lost over 500,000 soldiers, a shocking number that even included Mao's own son. But back in China, the war was spun into this incredible story of a heroic victory against American imperialism. And that narrative worked. It gave the party a massive boost in prestige and made them look totally legitimate in the eyes of the people. With the borders seemingly secure, the party could now turn its full attention back home. So in 1953, China kicked off its first 5-year plan. The goal was straight out of the Soviet Union's playbook: take a country of farmers and turn it into an industrial giant. And they wanted to do it at, warp speed.
And you know what? At first glance, the results were amazing. With a ton of Soviet help, China's heavy industry just exploded. Coal, iron, steel, production didn't just meet the targets, it blew right past them. For the very first time, China actually became a major oil producer. From the outside looking in, it really seemed like this whole command economy thing was a huge success. But there was a massive hidden cost to all this rapid industrial growth. See, to feed all the workers in the new factories and cities, you had to completely change farming. So the peasants were first encouraged, then kind of pushed, and then flat out forced into these huge farming collectives called cooperatives. By 1956, more than 80% of all peasant families were in one. They had to share everything: their land, their tools, even their animals. The party's real goal was to have total control over life in the countryside. And in getting that control, they were basically planting the seeds for an absolute disaster. So, by 1956, Mao was feeling pretty good about things.
So good, in fact, that he decided to, loosen the reins a little bit. He started this new campaign with a very poetic name, famously inviting intellectuals and experts to speak their minds about how the country was being run. It was sold as a genuine call for helpful feedback, a moment for new ideas to bloom.
Yeah, it was a trap, a total trap. When the criticisms actually started coming in, and boy did they come in, Mao was completely stunned and furious. The 100 Flowers were immediately cut down in a vicious political purge called the Anti-Rightist Campaign. At least 500,000 people who were brave enough to say something were publicly shamed, sent off to brutal labor camps, or just executed. And a rising star in the party, a guy named Deng Xiaoping, was one of the key people in charge of this crackdown.
The message couldn't have been clearer. If you criticize us, we will destroy you. And now, with all the critical voices totally silenced, Mao was free to launch his biggest, most radical, and, ultimately, most destructive plan yet. In 1958, he kicked off the Great Leap Forward. This was basically Mao's utopian fantasy turned into national policy. An absolutely relentless propaganda machine convinced the whole country that they could overtake Britain and America in just a couple of years by sheer force of will. Those farm cooperatives were merged into even bigger people's communes, where private life just stopped. They even banned private kitchens. Everyone had to eat together in these huge, chaotic, communal canteens.
The gap between the dream and the reality was just massive, and it happened right away. Farmers were ordered to stop farming and build these little furnaces in their backyards. They were told to melt down their own cooking pots and farm tools to make steel, most of which ended up being totally useless junk. At the same time, local officials, who were completely terrified of being punished, just started lying. They reported these ridiculously huge grain harvests that were pure fiction. The leaders in Beijing believed the reports, so they took their share of grain from the countryside, leaving the people who actually grew the food with absolutely nothing to eat.
The result was a famine, a catastrophic famine that was entirely man-made. The best estimate for the number of extra deaths from starvation and disease between 1958 and 1961 is somewhere around 45 million people. 45 million. That's almost 7% of China's entire population at the time. It is without a doubt one of the deadliest famines in all of recorded history, and it was a direct result of political ideology completely ignoring reality.
As the unbelievable scale of the horror finally started to become clear, the fallout from the Great Leap Forward would shake the Communist Party to its core and really change China's path forward in a big way.
The disaster was so huge that even Mao himself had to publicly admit that, he'd made some mistakes. He kept his title as chairman, but he took a step back from the day-to-day work of running the country. The more practical leaders, like Zhu Enlai and Deng Xiaoping again, stepped up to handle the crisis. They immediately started undoing the worst policies, shrinking the communes, and even letting people have small private gardens again, just desperately trying to get food production back on track.
Now, while all this chaos was happening inside China, its most important relationship on the world stage was completely fallen apart. Mao was livid when the Soviet leader Khrushchev criticized Stalin back in 1956. He saw it as a betrayal of communism. The tension just kept building over everything from Taiwan to border disputes, and then came the final insult. In a 1962 border war between China and India, the Soviet Union actually backed India. The two biggest communist countries in the world were now sworn enemies.
So now China was basically all alone, and they were determined to do things their own way. They poured a ton of money and resources into building their own nuclear weapons. And in 1964, against all the odds, they did it. They detonated their first atomic bomb. China was now the world's fifth nuclear power. It was a loud and clear message to the rest of the world. We are a major force and we will not be pushed around.
And all of this leaves us with a really deep and complicated question, doesn't it? The first few decades of the People's Republic were filled with suffering and destruction on a scale that's just hard to even process, all driven by this intense political ideology. And yet somehow, from the ashes of that exact same period, a new China began to form, one that would eventually rise to become a global superpower. Figuring out that contradiction, well, that's really the key to understanding the whole story of modern China.